Good morning and welcome to the Everyday Christian Women podcast, where normal women get together and discuss the things in their everyday lives and look to see how we can include God in that. I'm Amy, I'm your hostess, and I am really looking forward to today. First, I want to start with something very close to my heart, a quote that says, "Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can." And this quote, though it's contested, is usually attributed to John Wesley. And I think about this as I think about all of the things going on in our country and our world today. There are people hurting right now. There are missing people. There are people who have died. There are people without water, without electricity, without assistance from the hurricane, from wars overseas, from poor living conditions. They lack food and shelter. There are people facing persecution for their faith or their lifestyle. Overall, there are just a lot of people hurting throughout the earth. And even though we know that this is the way that things go in a broken world, it still hurts us too, especially because we want to help, but we don't know how. Many of us can't go to these places and help, whether it wouldn't be safe or it's not allowed, or we just don't have the ability. I can't walk away from my family and my husband and travel to help people that have been affected by the hurricane. And even if I could make those travel arrangements, where would I stay? How would I not be more of a burden in a place that already is overburdened and doesn't have resources? We don't have the money, and most people don't have the money to send. We're struggling ourselves in many parts of the country. And so even though our hearts go to these people, we can't reach into our pocket to help people who need it. We want to do something, but we don't know what. And there are people who have the means, who have the intent, but they're being told not to send aid directly, to not try to bring aid directly. And I think that's something that people in other arenas need to be looking into, because maybe there really are good reasons for that, but I don't know what they would be. There are resources that are being redirected, stopped altogether, and sent to organizations that are supposed to be distributing these resources, but people are concerned as to whether their financial donation or their items that they are donating to help these people are even reaching the people that they are wanting to help. Our hearts hurt for the people struggling. We want to send aid to people in war-torn areas. We want to send aid to people who have no electricity and no water. All of these needs that they have, we want to help fill, but we feel so helpless and useless and completely impotent to do anything. This is the moment that you will hear a lot of people say, "Well, all we can do is pray." And that really gets under my skin. It implies that prayer is our last resort, our only hope when all else has failed. And this is not the way that we should be looking at prayer. If we are Christians, prayer should be our first resource, our first response to any situation. There is a sticky note on my desk right in front of my keyboard that says pray first. And this should be our response in everything. Pray first, because when we look at prayer as our emergency brake, then we are stealing so much of the power of what prayer is. Prayer is the greatest weapon we could possibly have. It is our connection to God. It is the way that we ask for what we need and what others need. We intervene for these people who are hurting on our knees. And that is not weak. That is not helpless. That is our weapon. It is the best thing that we can do. It is the first thing we should do. We are going to talk about the power of prayer more thoroughly in a different episode, but for this moment, I want you to think when someone says, all we can do is pray, that is defeatist, and we are not defeated when we pray. We can use that as our greatest resource, not our last chance. So let's pray for the people in these areas that need help. Let's help them the way that we can, and let's never underestimate the power of prayer. But today's episode is actually about frustration. Every single one of us, whether in our job, our family, our household tasks, every day of our lives face some amount of frustration. Now, we all handle it differently. Some things get to us when other things are easy to shrug off. But all of us face frustration. Something I discovered more recently than I'd like to admit, but I did at least finally figure it out, is that frustration comes from unmet expectations. Whether we have reasonable or unreasonable expectations, we do have expectations for the way things will go. The interactions we have with others, how we spend our time, these things have expectations. And when those expectations aren't met is when we become frustrated to varying degrees and not always proportionate to the actual event. Have you ever been over the top angry about something so small, and when you have to look back at it later, you just shake your head at yourself and wonder why on earth you overreacted and behaved that way over something so unimportant? But on the flip side of that, have you ever felt mild annoyance at what other people have said is a really big deal, and you look at them and think that they are way overreacting? Before I tell you the story of how this realization came to be, I need to take a minute to talk to you about something very important, and the two things are connected. You'll see how in just a minute. Before I go into that story, I want to talk for a second about postpartum anxiety. My daughter is 8 months old. She is my 5th child, and I did not even know until this pregnancy what postpartum anxiety is. I had heard of postpartum depression, but postpartum anxiety was a term that had never come up when my 4 sons were born. And so I was frightened, and I was not prepared when this baby was born for the frightening thoughts and the immense anxiety. I would sit to feed her throughout the night, and just all these horrible, frightening thoughts of what could happen to her, or how I could fail her, or how she could get hurt, kept running through my head, and they overwhelmed me and made it almost impossible to function in day-to-day life. And yes, during that first period with a brand new baby, it's very common to feel overwhelmed because you are exhausted and you're doing all these new things for this little person who can't tell you very well what they need. But this is something different. This is crippling anxiety, and not necessarily what you might think of as anxiety, even a lack of desire to do things and disinterest in your day-to-day life. And even though thankfully not in my case, but for a lot of women, it comes out as a disconnection from your new baby. Thankfully, I had heard of this, and so I went to my doctor as quickly as I could and said, there is something wrong. I think I have postpartum anxiety. I am afraid of taking my baby out of the house. I am afraid to drive anywhere in the car with her because we could be in an accident. I am afraid of dropping her, even though I am exceptionally careful, and so is my husband. I'm terrified of SIDS. I'm terrified of so many things. I have all of these unwanted thoughts, and I can't keep going like this. I spent a lot of years getting my mental health to a good place, and I will not sacrifice that to something by keeping quiet. So thankfully, my doctor worked with me. We have gotten to a place where I am treated for that postpartum depression. I am months and months with that behind me, but it really drove home to me that women need to know. So if you have a new baby, if you are going to have a baby, please, please, please be aware that this is a big risk and that you are not alone, you are not crazy, and you are not doing anything wrong. This is just one of those things that can happen that too many people don't hear about. There is my public service announcement. Please, if you have children or are going to have children, look into education about the things that can make having children harder than it already is. Now that we have that out of the way, this is the story of how I came to understand more about the connection between frustration and unmet expectation. When this baby was about 2 months old, she was still not sleeping through the night, unsurprisingly, and she was a contact sleeper. So even once we were able to transition her into sleeping in her bassinet, quite frequently she needed someone sitting next to her with a hand on her to help her sleep. And so if she woke up in the night and needed fed or needed changed, it generally meant sitting with her for 20 to 45 minutes while she settled back down. These are perfectly normal, expected parts of being a parent. I am not complaining that they exist, but that doesn't change the fact that you're also exhausted by it. I was the nighttime parent. My husband works early in the morning, and the way that we agreed on it is that we are very fortunate that he works from home. And so when he would get up for work in the morning, he would take her, and he called her his little coworker, and he would take her in his office, and I would get to sleep. So I was the nighttime parent, he was the morning parent, and we got to share the afternoons and evenings together. And one night I was sitting next to the bassinet with my hand on my baby, and I could feel myself getting so frustrated. And so I prayed. I often prayed while sitting next to her because in the quiet of the night, when you have to be awake, but you can't really do anything else, it's a good time to talk to God. So I sat there praying because I don't want to be the angry parent. I don't want to direct frustration at people who do not deserve it. This little baby was not doing anything wrong. She was not misbehaving. She had no idea how to misbehave. It's simply that her little body does not operate on the same schedule as mine, especially that early. So I sat there and I asked God to help me with this anger I could feel rising because I knew it was not directed at my child. And I asked myself, was it directed at my husband? And the answer is absolutely not. We had decided on this together, and more than once he offered to be the person who got up with her at night to give me a break from that. But at the time she was also still breastfed. And so it wasn't very practical, even though his heart was in the right place. So as I sat there praying, I began to ask, well, what am I actually upset about? I'm not upset with my child. I'm not upset with my husband. I am simply upset because I am tired and I want to be in bed. And that is a frustration with the situation, not with a person. It doesn't change the fact that I was tired and crabby, but it did help me to identify where the frustration was coming from. I have tried to continue this lesson into my day-to-day life, and it's not as easy when the people that are around you are awake. It was much simpler to slow down and think about being angry at the situation and not at the people in it when they were both asleep. That's not common during our day, and it is a hazard that we have to avoid, to snap at or lash out at people because we are frustrated, even though it can be very easy to do. It's so important that we take that moment, we pause and ask, where is the frustration coming from? What is my expectation that has not been met? I expected to be able to sleep. I am not able to sleep. Therefore, I am frustrated. If the expectation is that my son will be on time for an appointment and he is not ready and not in the car when he is supposed to be, my frustration is that I expect him to be ready on time because I am a very punctual person, and now we might be late. So these frustrations happen, but if we can identify the source instead of just directing them at the nearest target, we can be more self-controlled. And of course, in Galatians 5, one of the fruits of the Spirit is self-control. It is one of the evidences of our maturity in Christ. Can we do that in our day-to-day lives? Can we take those frustrations, look at them, and say, what am I actually upset about? What is getting to me and why? Another scripture I'd like to share with you is James chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. That's from the New International Version. Anger just doesn't work. Practically speaking, anger is ineffective for contributing to the purposes and expectations God has for us. The world tells us anger can manipulate or intimidate people. Anger gives us the feeling that we are in control, even making ourselves feel better for a few minutes. Getting our own way, proving that we're the ones in the right, and venting our frustrations can be satisfying in the moment, but it doesn't result in much happiness in the long run. This is true even from a non-spiritual perspective. Did winning an argument, yelling at someone, or storming around the house slamming cupboard doors make you feel better overall? In the moment, maybe, but long run, do you feel better? I'm not saying don't find a way to get built up frustration out of your body. There are many good suggestions for getting rid of all those extra chemicals in your body, like adrenaline, that encourage us to explode. One of the good ones is exercise. Although for me, the suggestion of going for a walk to cool down is actually likely to make me angrier rather than calmer. I hate exercise. It's always felt like a punishment rather than an outlet, but I do admire people for whom that is their go-to stress relief. For some people, it's withdrawing to somewhere quiet and taking deep breaths or meditating. This is closer to my approach. As Christian women, it is always wise to add prayer to the mix, whether you are going for a walk, going for a run, taking that 5 minutes to yourself, stepping out of the room. Even if the prayer is, God, I am so angry at this person or this circumstance right now, and I just want to yell and have it be fixed. God is not unaccustomed to our frustration and anger, and He is more than prepared to listen to us vent to Him, even when we're angry with Him. I have told some friends very recently who are going through a lot of things. Everything seems to be going wrong for her right now. Her healthcare, paperwork, transportation, everything keeps getting messed up. No matter how much she prays, it feels like God isn't listening, or He doesn't care, or maybe He isn't even there. Does this sound familiar to you at all? This woman whose whole life has been steeped in faith from her childhood is questioning her faith, questioning where is God in all of this. And maybe this does sound familiar to you. I've been there. Job essentially told God finally, after everything he went through, will you just leave me alone and let me die? And maybe, hopefully, you haven't felt this far when it comes to your faith, but there are times when you feel as though you just want to ask God, if you can't help me, if you won't pull me out of this, could you at least just leave me alone so that the suffering doesn't feel worse? And no, I'm not saying that's the right attitude, but we still should pray. Even if you feel like prayer is not being heard, not being answered, or all you have to say is, God, I am angry with you, this also is acceptable to Him. Now, do we need to come back later and examine our hearts? Absolutely. But in the moment, we just need to talk to God. Before you think that there is something unchristian or unbiblical, I'd like you to look at some of the Songs of Lamentation. David reached out to God and said, I don't understand why you're doing this to me. Why am I suffering? And other people who do evil are prospering. Where is this glorifying you, God? So even a man after God's own heart took the time to ask Him, what gives? If time allows, when you get frustrated, I encourage you to try this approach. Pause. This is the first step. Just stop. One of my favorite social media influencers, though I absolutely hate that title, Tori Phantom, has great advice on this. She says, and I'm not quoting her accurately, so definitely go look up her channel and get it in her own words, But she says if it's not a true emergency with someone's life or safety on the line, it doesn't have to be dealt with right now. It may seem like it, but it just doesn't. Take the time to practice the pause so your reaction is one you won't regret. Then try to answer the question, what am I really mad about? What was my expectation? If the kids should be in bed asleep at 9 o'clock, not whining or climbing out of bed, and they are, there's the unmet expectation. You're feeling like this time belongs to you. You shouldn't have to be responsible for other people's needs for a few minutes or hours, and that has been interrupted. Other drivers should know the rules of the road and respect safe driving practices. My husband should know where the spatulas go after living in the same house for 9 years. Some of these are reasonable expectations. How about a few that aren't reasonable? Like, say, my baby should sleep longer so that I can sleep longer. Or maybe the weather was supposed to be perfect for going to the zoo, and instead it's rainy and cold and windy. These are not things that are reasonable expectations. We don't have control over the weather. Newborn babies do not sleep for 6 to 8 hours at a time typically. Also identify whether your expectations are reasonable or unreasonable. Identify why you're mad. Think of whether or not you want to direct your anger where you feel like it, or if you need to look at the actual source. Are you mad at your kid or anxious because you don't want to be late? Are you angry at the customer service person who can't help you, or angry that your order that you paid for was messed up in the first place and you have to deal with fixing it? If we look to where the problem actually is, we'll be less likely to direct anger at people who don't deserve it and avoid the guilt later, because that's the next step. Maybe the release of anger in the moment makes you feel better, but how long does it take you to feel guilty about it? And then you get to live with the guilt, even if you apologize. I know this is one of my failings. I am good at apologizing to other people. I never wanted to be a parent who couldn't tell my children I'm sorry and I got it wrong. So I make sure that if I have a bad parenting moment, I try later to go to my child and say, you know what? I got that wrong. I should not have reacted that way, and I am sorry. Will you forgive me? Then, even though I have done the right things, and even if my child does forgive me, or my husband, or my friend, I still have to deal with the guilt of having hurt this person because of my lack of self-control. And none of us needs more guilt. I don't handle things perfectly. Now, this revelation has been a big deal, but I'm still working on it. And it's a learning process, but it's one worth practicing. Another more recent example does tell me how far I've come in dealing with frustration, because it also involves the baby and sleep and my husband, but this time my expectations were a little more reasonable and my reaction was a little bit better. Not perfect, but the story goes, the baby was down for a nap. She had been down for a nap for about 45 minutes, and I really didn't have a huge expectation for any more than another 45 minutes. So I went to our bedroom and laid down, not with the hope to actually sleep, but just to relax for a little while. And my husband came upstairs to tell me something that was going on in his work day. I love to be part of his work and a sounding board for him so that he can discuss things. He also was speaking in a normal tone of voice, not loudly, but loud enough that he disturbed the baby across the hallway from us. And as soon as I heard her fuss, I looked at him and I said, "You just woke up the baby." And in that moment, I felt my frustration coming out at him. The expectation was that I would have 15 to 45 more minutes in which I was not responsible for a small person and that he should be at work. Well, he's perfectly allowed to take a 15-minute break from his work to come talk to me. He just didn't recognize that that time I had allotted to something else. But I didn't want to get angry at him, and certainly not at the baby. So I paused and I said, "It's okay." And I went and I took care of our daughter and went on with our afternoon. Later that day, I described to him why I had been frustrated by the situation, and we talked about it, and it was fine. I have grown, maybe not as much as I need to, but again, it's a process. It takes time, and he understood that the unmet expectation in that moment had been perfectly reasonable. I also didn't damage our relationship or cause tension and unrest for the rest of the day just because I had had a moment of frustration. None of these are shocking principles you've never heard before. They're not even solely Christian ideas. I just hope that they help you get through an exceptionally frustrating world a little bit easier, with a little bit less guilt and a little bit more peace about how you handle situations. I want you to give yourself grace for not getting it right all the time. We teach small children the song, "God's Still Working on Me," to make me who I ought to be. And this is true through our whole lives. Let God keep working on you, and have a great day. I'll talk to you again next week.